George Harrison was known as the quiet Beatle. Gentle, spiritual, always searching for peace. To millions of fans, he was the soul of the band, the one least likely to hold a grudge. But that image was only half the truth. Behind his calm exterior, Harrison carried a rage so deep it never fully healed. And the person he despised most was not an outsider or enemy of the group. It was one of his own brothers in music. Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind this hidden hatred. Because once you understand why, you'll never see the Beatles the same way again. From the very beginning, George Harrison was never at peace in the Beatles. As a teenager, he looked up to John Lennon as a figure of awe. Paul McCartney, meanwhile, was charismatic, confident, and musically advanced in ways Harrison admired. The two of them would sit together on a Liverpool bus, guitars in hand, rehearsing chords and chasing the same dream of escaping poverty through music. For George, Paul's approval mattered more than anything. His encouragement felt more valuable than applause, and in those early moments, Harrison believed he had found not just a partner, but someone who truly valued him as an equal. That admiration, however, slowly began to corrode. As the Beatles rose from smoky clubs to international stardom, John and Paul became the songwriting titans, the faces of Beatlemania, the voices on magazine covers, the stars who commanded interviews. George, meanwhile, was cast as the quiet one. To the world, it seemed a harmless, even charming label, but to Harrison, it became a prison. He wasn't quiet because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because every time he tried to speak, his voice was drowned out by louder egos, sharper tongues, and the unrelenting dominance of Lennon and McCartney. By the mid-1960s, George had songs burning inside him, melodies as brilliant as anything Paul or John were writing. But when he offered them, he was met with indifference. Paul often treated his compositions like afterthoughts, side projects to be squeezed in between his own grand visions. John could be casually cruel, brushing aside Harrison's work with dismissals. Even when George presented something extraordinary, like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the others barely noticed until he brought in Eric Clapton to play guitar, forcing them to recognize what they had tried to ignore. For George, this wasn't just rejection. It was humiliation. The imbalance grew unbearable. Album after album, he was permitted only 2 or 3 songs, while Lennon and McCartney filled the records with their experiments. Numbers alone weren't the issue. It was the attitude. Paul, with his relentless perfectionism, would spend hours perfecting his own tracks. But when it came to George's songs, the effort was minimal. Years later, Harrison recalled bitterly, Paul would always help along when you'd done his 10 songs. Then when he got round to doing one of mine, he would help. It was silly. It was very selfish. That selfishness made every studio session feel like a battlefield where Harrison was treated as an unwanted soldier. The personal toll cut deeper than the professional one. George and Paul had once been like brothers, but as Paul seized more control, George felt pushed aside. Paul's dominance, once impressive, now felt suffocating. His constant instructions, his tendency to play bass lines, guitar parts, and even dictate arrangements left Harrison with no room to breathe. In a 1974 interview, George admitted, "I would join a band with John any day, but I could not join a band with Paul McCartney. He's a fine bass player, but he's a bit overpowering at times." Behind those careful words was a lifetime of frustration and a wound that never healed. By January 1969, the simmering tension erupted into open conflict. During the Let It Be rehearsals at Twickenham Studios, cameras captured the suffocating atmosphere. Paul lectured, John withdrew, and George sat silently until he snapped. His words, calm but icy, cut through the room. "I think I'll be leaving the band now. Get a replacement." Then he walked out. For 12 days, the greatest band in history teetered on collapse. The world never knew how close they came to ending, not because of drugs or money, but because George Harrison could no longer endure the constant dismissal from the men he once idolized. When George returned, it was not reconciliation. It was resignation. The group moved from Twickenham to Apple Studios. Paul's grand plan for a live concert was abandoned, and Harrison agreed to continue. But inside, something had broken. The friendship he once had with Paul was gone. Admiration had curdled into bitterness. What once felt like a brotherhood now felt like servitude. George was no partner, just a guest in a club that never truly welcomed him. Even years later, the scars remained. In his 1980 autobiography, I, Me, Mine, George barely mentioned Lennon at all, and spoke of Paul only with distant caution. That silence was louder than anger. It revealed that the wounds of being overshadowed, mocked, and ignored had never healed. For George Harrison, the Beatles were not the dream of brotherhood the fans believed in. To him, they were a cage. What the world celebrated as harmony, Harrison remembered as confinement. That pain echoed in every note he wrote afterward, in every cautious word he shared with the public. And it was this pain that explained why, when history looked back, George Harrison was no longer willing to stay silent. His story inside the Beatles was not one of surrender. It was one of resistance, waiting to be recognized. His return to the band in 1969 was not a surrender. It was a transformation. Something inside him had snapped at Twickenham Studios, and from that moment on, George Harrison would never again play the quiet Beatle on anyone else's terms. When George walked back into the studio, he was no longer the same man who had once accepted silence as his role. He returned armed with determination. He would not remain the third Beatle in a group where only two men seemed to matter. From that moment on, George Harrison was ready to fight. His weapons were not arguments or shouting matches with Lennon or McCartney. He had no taste for that. His weapon was song. For nearly a decade, George had been quietly storing melodies, hoarding fragments of music, polishing lines of poetry that no one had bothered to ask about. Lennon and McCartney were too busy competing with one another, too absorbed in their own brilliance, to imagine that George might be preparing his own revolution. By 1969, the floodgates opened. Songs poured from his guitar, raw and insistent, demanding to be heard. The evidence was clear in Abbey Road. For the band, it was a farewell, but for George, it was an arrival. For years, his songs had been treated like afterthoughts, 2 per album, 3 if he was lucky. But this time, George delivered Here Comes the Sun and Something. They were not just strong tracks, they were undeniable. Here Comes the Sun, written in Eric Clapton's garden, shimmered with hope after months of turmoil. Something, by contrast, was a love song so pure and universal that even Lennon admitted it was the best track on the record. Paul praised it as George's finest composition. Frank Sinatra went further, calling it the greatest love song of the past 50 years. For the first time, a George Harrison song was released as an A-side single paired with Lennon's Come Together. The single topped charts worldwide. To the public, George had finally stepped out of the shadows. But inside the band, recognition was far more complicated. Lennon seemed distant, offering little praise. Paul, while supportive in interviews, still carried himself as the Beatles' chief architect. For George, the silence was deafening. He had broken through the wall, but the validation he most craved from those who had dismissed him remained muted, reluctant, even resentful. This paradox defined the tragedy of George's late Beatles years. He was at the peak of his creativity, writing some of the band's most enduring songs. Yet the environment poisoned his victories. Each success reminded him not of acceptance, but of how long he had been denied. Compliments felt late and begrudging. Being right only deepened the wound. When the band fractured in 1970, George wasted no time unleashing what he had kept inside. While Lennon and McCartney began solo projects, George detonated. All Things Must Pass was not just an album. It was a triple album, a torrent of songs Lennon and McCartney had ignored, brushed aside, or failed to understand suddenly poured forth. The quiet Beatle overwhelmed the world with a body of work so massive it stunned critics and fans alike. The lead single, My Sweet Lord, became the first solo Beatle track to reach #1 in the United States. The record sold millions, outshining Lennon's Plastic Ono Band and McCartney's debut. For George, it was vindication. Every note of All Things Must Pass was a declaration of independence, a cry of revenge against years of being told he wasn't good enough. Critics marveled at its scale, calling it the album Lennon and McCartney never saw coming. Yet success came with a bitter edge. George knew he could only create it because the cage of the Beatles had been broken. The very band that should have nurtured his genius had instead forced him to bury it until silence was no longer possible. Paul McCartney later admitted they had underestimated George. In a 2020 interview, he reflected, "It was easy to underestimate George because me and John had always written most of the stuff and had most of the singles. George was a late bloomer as far as writing was concerned, but boy did he bloom. He wrote some of the greatest songs ever. It was honest, but it came decades too late. To George, it confirmed what he had always known. His best work had been overlooked until the world forced recognition. Even at the height of his solo success, the scars lingered. In interviews, resentment surfaced like an old wound. By 1974, George bluntly remarked, "I would rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney." It was more than a critique of Paul's style. It was a rejection of years of feeling overpowered and undermined. He admitted he could never imagine being in a band with Paul again. The bitterness was unmistakable. For all their history, for all their brotherhood, Paul was someone George could never fully forgive. The tragedy lay in the emptiness of victory. George had proven himself. #1 singles, Grammy recognition, critical acclaim. He organized the concert for Bangladesh in 1971. One of the first major benefit concerts in rock history, raising millions for humanitarian aid. He had become more than a Beatle. He was a cultural force in his own right, and yet in private. George admitted success did not erase the years of dismissal. He once joked that even if he wrote the greatest song in history, it would still be seen as just George's song compared to John or Paul. His bitterness was not just about pride. It was about identity. George had entered the Beatles as the youngest, the apprentice with wide eyes. He had hoped the band would grow with him, giving him room to evolve. Instead, the walls closed in. Paul's perfectionism, John's sarcasm, the press's quiet Beatle label, all of it left George feeling trapped and voiceless. His triumphs were not born of joy, but defiance. He had to prove himself not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. Even in his autobiography, I, Me, Mine, George's silence about Lennon, and his guarded references to Paul spoke volumes. Fans found the omissions shocking, but for George, they were deliberate. He erased the men who had once overshadowed him. It was his final act of resistance. If they had ignored him in life, he would ignore them in memory. The quiet Beatle, in the end, did not find his voice through confrontation, but through silence sharpened into a quiet revenge, yet the question lingers. Was he ever truly satisfied? That is the tragedy at the heart of George Harrison's story. On paper, he had everything. Chart-topping hits, solo acclaim, respect from critics and fellow musicians. Even Paul McCartney eventually acknowledged his brilliance. The world sang George's songs, covered them, and immortalized them. Yet George himself remained restless, haunted by years of being dismissed. He searched for peace in Indian philosophy, in gardening, in withdrawing from fame. His home became filled not with applause but with music and prayer. Recognition had come, but it had arrived too late to erase the pain of being silenced when it mattered most. That lingering wound shaped what followed. The cold reality of life after the Beatles, when fractured friendships hardened into permanent scars. The feud with Paul cast a long shadow. When the chaos of the 1970s finally settled, the four Beatles drifted into separate orbits. Paul carried his wounds into wings. John Lennon retreated into domestic seclusion with Yoko Ono. George Harrison defined himself with one word: distance. It wasn't only distance from the world's demands for another Beatles record. It was distance from Lennon himself. By the early 1980s, that distance had solidified into something immovable. Lennon's assassination in December 1980 should have broken down those walls. Many fans imagined George collapsing in grief, admitting to the press that despite everything, a brotherhood still endured. But the reality was far colder. His response was guarded, even awkward. He spoke of Lennon's death not with the intimacy of a lifelong bond, but with the detachment of someone losing a man he barely knew anymore. It's difficult to take in. He was murdered, but he'll live on in his music. The words were true, but they were clinical. Millions had expected heartbreak, but what they heard was silence, almost deafening. Paul fumbled with his now infamous comment, "It's a drag." Ringo flew to New York to comfort Yoko. George, however, stayed in England, wrapped in the solitude Lennon had once mocked as mystical nonsense. For a man who had spent his life writing about love, peace, and spiritual awakening, George's refusal or inability to publicly mourn Lennon shocked many. Whispers spread among fans. Had the resentment run so deep that even death could not dissolve it? The truth lay between tragedy and survival. George had spent years diminished, ignored, ridiculed by Lennon. Grief was tangled with scar tissue. To him, Lennon's voice was not only the voice of Imagine or Strawberry Fields. It was also the voice that had sneered at his songs, mocked his sitar, and dismissed his devotion to India as escapist fantasy. When Lennon died, George wasn't only mourning a man. He was mourning a relationship that had never healed. In that silence, he delivered his final act of defiance. But silence came at a cost. It left him with nowhere to put the anger, nowhere to bury the unresolved pain. He poured it into his work instead. In the early 1980s, with the release of Somewhere in England, fans heard not only the sound of a seasoned artist, but also the echo of a man still negotiating wounds that time refused to close. Music became both an escape and a mask. Proof to the world that he was moving forward, even as his heart remained trapped in the shadows of the past. As the years passed, the fractures inside George's heart never fully healed. His spiritual path deepened, but it also became a shield. Friends noticed he avoided direct conversations about Lennon, steering instead toward karma, destiny, or the fleeting nature of life. It was easier to philosophize than to confront the rawness of betrayal. For George, Lennon was not only gone physically, but erased in memory, dissolved into something unspeakable. The tragedy deepened in the 1990s. While Paul worked to cement his legacy, and Ringo enjoyed a resurgence as a touring act, George withdrew further into his sanctuary at Friar Park. The irony was painful. The man who had fought hardest to be heard within the Beatles chose a life of retreat, gardening, and chanting, as though the scars had convinced him the spotlight was poison. And yet even in retreat, Lennon haunted him. Interviews became battles. Reporters inevitably asked about John and George tensed. Sometimes he dismissed the question with a bitter laugh, sometimes with silence. What he never gave was reconciliation. The wound stayed raw. Then in 1999, George nearly lost his life in a violent home invasion. A deranged attacker broke into Friar Park and stabbed him multiple times. Though he survived, the ordeal left him scarred. Lying in hospital, he spoke of the fragility of existence. Some thought this brush with death would soften his heart toward Lennon's memory. But again, silence prevailed. Mortality had come close, but bitterness endured. The final years were cruel. Diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997, a bitter irony for a man whose voice had carried so much truth, George fought with determination, seeking treatment across Europe and the US. By 2001, the disease had spread to his lungs. Facing death, he spoke often of God, the soul's journey of letting go of earthly attachments. Yet even in these meditations, Lennon's absence loomed. Paul honored John publicly at concerts. Ringo spoke of him with warmth. George remained silent. His refusal to romanticize Lennon in death was his final rebellion. A stark truth. Not all wounds heal with time. When George died on November 29, 2001 at just 58, the world mourned the quiet Beatle. Tributes poured in celebrating his artistry, his spirituality, his humility. But beneath the grief, one question remained. Had his life been permanently scarred by the man he could never forgive? For many fans, the harshest realization was that George's bitterness toward Lennon, born from years of neglect and humiliation, had never been resolved. John's sudden death left no chance for reconciliation. George followed 2 decades later, carrying the unfinished story into the grave. Even in death, the tension lingered. At the concert for George in 2002, Paul and Ringo performed together in tribute, speaking warmly of their friend. Yet, when it came to Lennon, silence filled the hall. George's memorial reflected the same wound his life had left unfinished. The ghost of Lennon hovered not as a cherished memory, but as a shadow unresolved. And yet Harrison's legacy is not defined by bitterness alone. The pain Lennon inflicted pushed him to create some of his greatest work. All Things Must Pass remains a masterpiece born from rejection's ashes. Songs like Isn't It a Pity and Beware of Darkness were more than music. They were weapons forged from wounds. Even his embrace of Indian spirituality, mocked by Lennon, endured and reshaped Western fascination with the East. Ironically, in trying to belittle him, Lennon only sharpened George's resolve. Still, the tragedy remains. George Harrison may have found spiritual peace, but the human beneath was bruised beyond repair. He never had the final conversation, never heard the apology that might have healed him. His silence became his last word. For fans, that silence hurts most of all. To love the Beatles is to believe in brotherhood, in four men who conquered the world together. But George Harrison reminds us of a darker truth. Admiration can curdle into hatred, and sometimes a lifetime is spent surviving its weight. So, was George's story one of triumph or torment? Did his genius define him, or the suffering he endured? Was it Paul McCartney who validated his greatness, or Paul who cemented his pain? What do you think? Was Paul truly the man George hated most, or was their feud simply the price of being bound together in the world's most famous band? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more tragic stories from the lives of music legends, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next.